widely recognized that universities have a problem with being captured by radical ideologies, by anti-Semitism, violations of civil rights law. And the question is, can universities be trusted to reform themselves, or is outside accountability necessary, specifically from the government, such as the Civil Rights Division, the EEOC, and other agencies? So I'm going to make the case that internal reform has failed and it's not enough. And at this point, external accountability is really needed. So I'd like you just to step back and imagine an analogy. So imagine your local police department has a bunch of problems with its professionalism, and there's a lot of evidence of this. Is that department more likely to reform internally without external accountability or with external pressure? So why would universities be any different? Human nature is the same, right? So whenever somebody's overusing a parking meter, even the most banal example, how likely are they to call the police on themselves? And you can ask yourself, did the Catholic Church have its reformation by self-reformation, or did they need external accountability? Do corporations keep as meticulous records of their accounting practices when they're never externally audited? I think you see the pattern, which is that when there's some corruption, generally people don't change from within because of human nature. So imagine there's a nutrition faculty, like a school of nutrition, where 97% of the people are vegetarian. And then the couple of carnivores and omnivores are not really represented in teaching and research, and they're discriminated against in admissions and hiring. So do you think those vegetarians are likely to reform internally to allow the meat eaters in? You could think of as many analogies as you want, but I think we can see that the same pattern is noticed across all these situations. So in the universities, scholars who benefit from this kind of ideological monoculture don't really have as much of a reason to change because that system is feeding and rewarding them. So for example, amongst Harvard faculty, there's approximately 5,500% more liberals than conservatives. And wherever somebody is on that spectrum, it's pretty radical. So if people in universities admit that there's internal pedagogical or intellectual or moral problems, and they fix them, that would actually undermine their own authority. So there's not really an incentive to fix them. That would spoil the party. And then think about it from a university leader's perspective. They're not going to give up their prestige, which is very brittle, or their moral self-image and their intellectual comfort without external pressure. Because there's this conflict of interest for these insiders to reform. So it's a losing bet generally. So also, I think another reason why universities generally don't reform internally is because they tend to look down on the rest of America as somehow morally or intellectually inferior, which is really unfortunate. And there's often a lack of gratitude and lack of humility on the part of academics, especially because sometimes they're activists first and they have this kind of desire to reform the world in their own image rather than studying the world, which is more of their mission, studying in a disinterested manner. And these are the kind of things you'll hear at the end of a joke in the faculty lounge. But I think these professors and administrators don't really like the idea of somebody on the outside who's less credentialed than them, kind of cleaning up their own house, even if they're democratically elected. That's like an unacceptable ego threat. So that's why I don't think people like the idea of the Civil Rights Division enforcing things and enforcing civil rights law, for example. I also think that there's another reason why internal reform generally fails. It's because credentialed academics are highly linguistic creatures and they mistake discussions about things in the real world with actually changing things in the world. So writing a bunch of papers, doing conferences is not really going to change things as much as material incentives and public accountability. We can't mistake the president's office for the graduate seminar, and we can't mistake philosophy for politics. That's why, for example, DEI has been inhibited in the last 1 year more than it has in the last 12 years, probably because there's been all this external accountability. Another reason why I think internal reform has failed is because people who are reforming things are very pluralistic and relativistic in terms of their own ideology. And that's very powerless in terms of standing up to radicals on either side, radical right-wingers, radical left-wingers. But when you have these ideologies like DEI or critical constructivism, wokeism, they're going to generally take over a university because the moderates who are in charge of internal reform tend to be fairly weak-willed, let's just say, or powerless in terms of what they're willing to stand up to. So these kind of more secular religions that are very robust psychologically will tend to displace these more weak frameworks that don't really believe in truth or goodness. They're very neutral. And Generally, being militantly agnostic about what the university's purpose is not going to help the university survive, because their competitors are not allergic to moral judgments, and they're not worried about being agreeable. They're worried about enforcing their view of the world. The other thing is that a lot of the things that are coming to light these days have been around for decades in terms of problems that everyone's acknowledged. For example, the politicization of syllabi, the activist disciplines, the loyalty oaths that are required for admissions and hiring. Many of these problems, in addition to discrimination, for example, anti-Semitism, as well as discrimination against Asians and persons of European ancestry, these are things that have been going on for many decades. And the internal reformers never really got around to it. They never really found the motivation or inspiration to solve those problems, to enforce colorblind equality and meritocracy. So these external pressures have had to come in and fix things, which the whole situation reminds me of somebody with worsening gingivitis. They're waiting decades to get surgery, and they're going to get a humiliating lecture from their dentist, and they finally get dragged in by their spouse. And they're not likely to reform internally and show up for a lecture and a very painful surgery. And because of the similar dynamics psychologically, I think universities are not self-correcting ecosystems. They tend to protect and reward their own insiders for maintaining things the way they are. And these insiders are ironically the very people who are supposed to be responsible for changing things. So that's a conflict of interest for the insiders who are supposed to be reformers. And it's not really consistent with human nature for those people to change things for the better. So that's why I think at this stage of self-destruction in the university's trajectory, this external accountability isn't really ideological intrusion or tyranny. It's more institutional triage. It's trying to preserve the foundations of the university for truth-seeking. So I'm going to present some evidence that if you look over the last 10 years, it shows that whatever internal reform efforts that there have been in effect, they've been noble, but as an empirical matter, they've failed to produce meaningful structural changes over the last decade, despite everyone knowing about these challenges to free inquiry and the need for institutional neutrality and the respect for freedom of speech. Unfortunately, the prevailing culture of most universities has become more resistant to academic freedom, not less resistant, more resistant to civil discourse, more resistant to having ideological diversity, open inquiry, truth-seeking. So things have been getting worse rather than better. And I'm going to show you some data that backs that up. So in 2024, 83% of United States academics agreed that free speech was more limited than 10 years prior. So internal reform has not made free speech increase over that time. Number two, speech codes and bureaucratic restrictions on expression actually got worse over the past decade. So in 2024, 85% of top colleges have restrictive speech codes, and that number of schools with the worst policing is increasing. Number three, DEI loyalty oaths in hiring and promotion, they were never heard of 20 years ago. And since they've become widespread, this is not a problem that has gone away. It got so bad that in 2017, UC Berkeley's search committee rejected 600 of their 800 faculty applicants based solely on their DEI statements. So 75% of people got rejected, not based on the merits of their work, based on their DEI statements. Harvard University dribbled out a kind of ban of DEI statements in 2024 in one of its schools, as far as I know, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, but it didn't touch any of the other schools or the hospitals, the other academic centers. So that's what they were able to accomplish on their own. But now things have changed in 2025, where there's more pressure. Fourth, the violations of civil rights law and the meritocracy and admissions, this was never fixed by internal reform for decades. And it was really only called out by this outside accountability from the Supreme Court in 2023 in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. And in this case, a lot of the data show that students were given hundreds of percentage points in advantages and penalties depending on their race, just by checking off a box. And that is extremely unconstitutional and definitely a violation of civil rights law. And that was not something that internal reformers ever were able to accomplish. Number five, non-meritocratic hiring and promotion of faculty has not improved in the past decade. It's actually gotten worse. So, for example, in an analysis done from 2013 to 2023, patterns in faculty hiring at Harvard suggest the same kind of unequal standards and DEI quotas that have been discriminating against Asian Americans and European Americans in admissions for college students. That's also been shown to be present in selecting faculty. So a 2021 study found that over 4 out of 10 US and Canadian academics would not hire a Trump supporter. And these are the people who actually would admit it on a survey. So you can imagine what kind of percentages are there of people who are making these decisions in the back end. enforcing political discrimination. It should be a meritocratic process. Number 6, there's a proliferation of an $8 billion non-evidence-based diversity training industries have failed whenever they've been studied to show meaningful effects and likely even worsen biases. So you have this whole industry of diversity trainings that make people have worse biases and they don't work and they cause division. Number 7, we don't see improved viewpoint diversity. There's, if anything, worsening ideological homogeneity and conformity among the faculty. So if you look at the ratio of liberal to conservative professors, in 1969, it was maybe 65% more liberals than conservatives. But by 2022, it was 587%. And the views of academics are so out of touch with the average American that in 2021, there was a study that found that only 28% of American and Canadian academics would feel comfortable having lunch with somebody who opposes the idea of a trans woman accessing women's shelters. Only 28% would consider having lunch with that person. So that's a pretty extreme opinion. And so what we see is that political inclusion and diversity in American colleges is really just including a very narrow population's views, not even all of the liberals. It's only a portion of the liberals and the radical progressives. Those are the ones that are overrepresented in the university, but the entire middle, moderates, centrists, and conservatives entirely are mostly excluded from the university campuses, especially the elite ones or formerly elite ones. Number 8, I think the reason internal reform hasn't worked is because it depends on this empirically false premise, which is that more education correlates with more moderation, more reasonableness, more tolerance of intellectual variety. But when you look at the actual sociological data, we see that radicalization has this dose response curve with education, meaning that, I don't know the reason why, whether it's ideological training, self-selection, or maybe social pressure, when people have more education, it actually correlates with less moderation and more radical ideological views. And I'm thinking about research from Eric Kaufman here. So because academics on average are more radical as they get more educated, the highly educated are actually the least likely to reform themselves internally compared to, for example, a less educated set of common sense, like managers running a barbershop or people who are giving feedback on from their customers on its professionalism. Those kind of people are much more likely to reform because the highly credentialed academics, they're so radical, they're not going to really be convinced by those moderate voices. It's similar to going to a military school. Imagine you go to West Point and you have all these decorated military leaders. The more training they get in the military, the more likely they are to be for war. How likely are they going to be to reform themselves internally to become more pacifistic, more open to negotiation, soft power internally? It's not really likely. They need to have some outside voices, outside accountability. Number 9, more frequent punishment or cancellation of scholars has been happening as the years have gone on. So if you look at a well-known database called Scholars Under Fire, from 2000 to 2022, the number of scholars who've been canceled has increased by 3,000%. As they say, attempts to punish college and university scholars for their speech has skyrocketed over the last decades, from only 4 people in 2000 to over 145 in 2022. You can look at case studies too. Tyler Vanderweel of the Harvard School of Public Health, he wrote a shocking description of his treatment and attempted cancellation, and Professor Martin Kulldorff of Harvard Medical School, who lost his tenure for breaking taboos about COVID. 10th, I think the reform has failed because the ideology among the current people in control of universities, which is left-wing progressives, at the core of this belief system, this political ideology, is something inherently allergic to free inquiry. Just like you had some vegetarians running a nutrition school and the students and people are saying, hey, we need to allow meat to be sold in the department cafeteria. It's against the core tenets of their belief system to eat meat. So they're not going to really be open to the proposal from other people to allow meat to be eaten. Similarly, for radical progressive people, logic and reason is really not the core part of their ideology. Under this critical constructivist kind of secular religion, logic and reason are primarily just power tools. They're power plays of oppression. So if someone gives you an argument using reason and logic, it's just a mask of power. So if you try to use reason and logic to convince somebody who believes that, they're not going to really find it compelling. They're not going to believe in reason and logic. And that's the basis of an academic community. So it's not going to really work in an academic community because people who have that sort of pseudo religion, they don't believe in reason. They don't believe in logic. They think it's just power. They think it's all just relative. So the suppression of free speech is a natural outgrowth of that worldview, just like suppressing meat eating is a natural outgrowth of vegetarianism. So that's why people who are in that culture, you can't really trust them to reform internally because they're basically just following what their beliefs rationally imply. And that's why when you look at studies of support for academic freedom, consistent differences in how much people support academic freedom based on their baseline political ideology. And the more radical left they are, the less supportive they are of free inquiry. Number 11, I think civil discourse has also declined. That's why there's been widespread encampments in 2024 during protests, movements that violated the time and space and manner rules of academic communities. So these were not peaceful protests. They were actually violating the rules about taking over campus space. So if there was a culture of civil discourse, that wouldn't really have happened. People wouldn't be just taking over the president's building and blocking pathways, blocking people from going to class and moving. And then also worsening anti-Semitism doesn't really make sense if these internal reform efforts have really been successful. And in the critical social justice worldview, anti-Semitism comes right out of Karl Marx's famous essay on the Jewish question. That's the same arguments that we hear today. And that's one of the current sources of the current plague of hatred and anti-Semitism. An organization called Hillel International actually did a study of this. They showed that anti-Semitic incidents on campus reached their highest level during the 2024-2025 school year. So that's been empirically demonstrated. It doesn't really go along with internal reform working. The other thing is that open inquiry doesn't seem to be improving because grades have been inflating, and inflated grades undermine intellectual honesty because professors can't give honest feedback to their students, and students don't expect honest feedback on their performances and on their academic work. It's possible this is because students have become more fragile to negative academic feedback because of the larger cultural changes. And administrators and universities don't want to give accurate feedback because it shows group differences in performance, which is taboo. And then deans can't hide these double standards in admissions anymore, although they still try to by banning test scores. So they try to cover up the downstream consequences. Another example is how the humanities and social sciences have developed a culture of grievance confirmation rather than a culture of hypothesis testing, which is the classical ideal of social sciences. And all of this has resulted in open inquiry being inhibited. So for example, the only variables or the primary variables that are allowed to be expressed as causal explanations in the social sciences and humanities are things like bias and oppression, according to intersectional hierarchies or inverse hierarchies. These are the primary explanations that are socially acceptable. Everything else is taboo. But this has resulted in people being able to give very politically correct but intellectually vacuous or absurd papers. For example, the famous example of the grievance studies hoax, where people submitted made up papers to journals that were intellectually silly, vacuous, but they were published because they were politically correct. But then when there's something very intellectually rigorous, but is politically incorrect, for example, about sex differences, then it'll never get published and it can get you banned. For example, what happened to Lawrence Summers, the president of Harvard University, who lost his job for stating things that sex difference researchers don't find fairly controversial. And then even in the hard sciences, the epistemic culture has definitely changed over the last 3 decades, where there's been this creeping of critical constructivism or wokeism. So for example, if you look at the National Science Foundation over the last 30 years, it took on DEI ideology, and then it actually creeped into the funding criteria. So by 2020, over 50% of NSF, National Science Foundation funded grants, contain one or more of these left-wing ideological keywords, which is surprising. 50% is a lot. And for the National Science Foundation, that probably is not a central issue in geology or physics or molecular biophysics or whatever they're funding. And then when we look at the actual syllabi of what professors are teaching, what is obvious from recent analyses is students are increasingly taught what to think, not how to think. And the syllabi and the teaching structure no longer serves neutral frameworks for inquiry, but are themselves often ideologically curated documents. The typical social science humanities faculty is very radical left to maybe like center left liberal. So there's it's like very narrow spectrum of allowable thinking. And their syllabi are also like that too. So of course, there should be no surprise that the products of the mind are reflected by the type of mind that created it. And syllabi increasingly are shaped by these ideological filters whenever there's some moral or social or political topic on a syllabus. And rarely do we see a favored text being paired with a genuinely rigorous opposing argument. That's very rare. And I would say these are not really pockets of decay. They're entire departments or even entire fields that have been corrupted. So if you look at the American Sociology Association's theme for its annual meeting in 2024, it was intersectional studies, emphasizing sociology as a form of liberatory praxis, an effort to not only understand structural inequities, but to intervene in socio-political struggles. That's the field of sociology, representing all these departments and all these universities. But you could look at a lot of other fields too. You'd see even quantitative fields like psychology, experimental psychology are fairly well captured as well. But definitely, if you look at English literature, even philosophy, you see the same trends. Here's an example. If you look at a psychology department, you'll very rarely find a course on intelligence, even though IQ is among the single most replicated and important traits for predicting life outcomes. So if you're a 17 or 18-year-old kid and you're learning about the human mind, you're not being taught about intelligence, the capacity for reasoning, cognitive ability. But if it's really one of the most important predictors of life outcomes and it's something that can be trained, then why would you not teach somebody that? It's because it's politically incorrect to talk about intelligence. But there's hundreds of other examples across the humanities and social sciences where there'll be seminars and courses taught on these very niche topics that have very limited practical implications for how people actually interact, like things like stereotype threat or implicit bias. These are very hard to replicate findings, and they have tiny effects, and they're very controversial, hard to replicate, hard to show that they have an impact in the real world, but they're taught endlessly. Something like intelligence or IQ is not really hard to replicate and shows huge effects, huge predictive effects in many life outcomes, but you're not going to find anyone teaching about it. So again, I could go through all these departments and give many examples, but the university culture has been taken over by narrow ideologies, radical ideologies. And then the syllabi that these professors create reflects the biases of their creators. It's got nothing to do with the people. It's just the way the mind works. So if you went to Saudi Arabia and you went to their number one university, you probably wouldn't see a very accurate representation of the history of Zionism. If you went to North Korea and you looked at their departments in the North Korean universities, you're probably not going to see much about the history of capitalism and how the reduction of poverty and wealth creation has been primarily due to the expansion of markets in the world. You're not going to find any of that data or history. So it's just a result of narrowing the intellectual lenses that we're teaching with. And if you look at all these departments and look at the ratios of liberals to conservatives, it's hundreds of thousands of percentage points different. There's some departments where there's not even a single conservative at all. And that's not good for the culture of intellectual discourse because people are being discriminated against based on the purging of people with unacceptable thought. And if you ask professors, have you ever refrained from airing views or teaching in your teaching or research, you'll see that people in the center or on the right are much more likely to say yes, that they do refrain, they self-censor much more than people on the left because the dominant culture is a liberal progressive culture. Same thing for students. If you look at the views of students from 2016 to 2024, the perception that free speech rights are secure has dropped by 30 percentage points. It's down to only 43%. And in 2024, 2 in 3 students say self-censorship limits educationally valuable conversations on campus, and 2 in 3 report self-censoring on some topics during classroom discussions. So freedom of speech generally has been going down among students. For example, at Harvard, only about 1/3 of students feel comfortable expressing their opinions about controversial topics, and only 17% of conservatives say they feel comfortable expressing their opinions about controversial topics. And then when we look at graduate students and you ask them, are your political views a fit for academia? People on the right, 34%, 62% of them say their views would not fit in the university, whereas on the left, among the very or somewhat left-wing people, only 8%, 6% of people say their views don't fit. So there's a huge skew there as well. In addition, faculty themselves feel they can't speak freely. So in 2024, nationally, only 27% of faculty think academic freedom is secure on their campuses. And 35% of faculty say they recently toned down their writing for fear of controversy, compared to only 9% of faculty who said the same thing during the McCarthy era many decades ago. So according to this one metric, it's much worse now than the McCarthy era. And at Harvard in 2024, more than half of Harvard professors are too afraid to discuss controversial topics with students. That's in 2024. And then in 2021, a national study found that in the social sciences and the humanities, over 9 in 10 Trump supporting academics and 8 in 10 Brexit supporting academics say they would not feel comfortable expressing their views to a colleague. And more than half of North American and British conservative academics admit self-censoring in research and teaching. So there's a lot of self-censoring. There's definitely a case for a hostile climate for people who don't fit the narrow radical left-wing beliefs. And if you look at surveys on this question, if you ask the professors, is there a hostile climate for your beliefs in the university? People on the very far left or the fairly left, only 3 to 5% of people say that. But on the right side, the conservative side, it's 69 to 71% of people feel a hostile climate. And similarly, people on the left are much more likely to say they identify with the culture of their department. People on the right are much less likely to say that they identify with the culture of their department. So these are studies that replicate the same things. They're not particularly surprising. So what about the objection that says, I think the future is going to be better because there's going to be reform in younger generations? You call this the, I believe the children are the future objection. I think this is also not likely because youngsters are even more radical and less supportive of free speech than the current insiders who are in charge. So if you look at people who are baby boomers, the older generation above 60 right now, these are the academic freedom leaders. They're the most supportive of free speech. They're the most likely to believe in things like reason and truth and logic. And this is the generation that is very tepid towards reform. They're the ones that have failed in their internal reform efforts. They've spent like half a century in academia, and their reputations are resting on things staying the same. Maybe this is like a kind of faculty club Stockholm syndrome, where they've been captured by this institution and now they are undermining their own interests and don't know it. But if you look at the millennial generation born between 1981 and 1996, 40% of them say limiting offensive speech is permissible. That's 40%. That's a lot. And in Generation Z, even younger than them, they're the most likely to say they would end their relationship with a family member if that person expressed a political view they find inappropriate, a family member. So they would actually cut off family members based on their political views. They're the most likely. So that means that the younger people are more into censorship and cancel culture. So the future of self-reform is not very bright. And if the baby boomers have failed, the younger generations are not likely to be more pro-free speech, pro-academic freedom. Younger people are less supportive of academic freedom and more likely to support campaigns to cancel an academic. For example, they're more likely to say the idea that we must change the way people talk to protect people's feelings is important rather than just saying people are too easily offended and we need to promote academic freedom. They're more likely to support a dismissal campaign, maybe like dismissing an academic who says something that's protected but offensive. So I think if you look at all of this data, you have to conclude that on the whole, internal reform efforts have totally failed in the last 10 or 15 years. The current insiders who are trying to reform everything have massive conflicts of interest and they have very minuscule incentives to self-regulate. And that's why I think outside accountability is necessary because universities are almost suicidal at this point. Their self-regulation has been quite minimal. And despite their good intentions, internal reform has failed. So the universities now are trying to keep taking federal funding and not follow federal laws. They don't want to submit to government regulation oversight. They don't want to follow the Civil Rights Act. They don't want to follow the employment laws. And they don't see themselves as serving the common good as a primary purpose of their existence in a democratic nation. And that nation makes their existence possible, but they don't really see the sense of obligation to serve the common good. And all of that is going to be worked out by lawyers, of course, whether the government's actions are illegal or not. I think that's not really my area of expertise or concern. I really think that the government should also follow the law, and so should the universities. But I do think it's pretty clear that a radical political ideology of any kind is going to undermine the effective telos of the university for truth-seeking and open inquiry. And given the current self-destructive trajectory of the universities, I do think the future has to change because I can't even imagine how it could get worse. It's almost like an overdose. If someone overdoses on opioid, you have to give them Narcan to keep them alive. You have to get them back to consciousness. And you need CPR sometimes. I see what's happening here as CPR because public trust in our universities has declined over the past 10 years. It's very low compared to 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago even. So I see the situation as an escalation to a point of self-destructiveness. And we can't just trust another round of self-control, internal reform, because it's not worked. It hasn't worked for decades. It's almost willful negligence when imagine somebody's like overdosing on opioids and they keep saying, just trust me to have another prescription. It's negligent and actively harmful to just keep letting somebody harm themselves. So I do see it as a necessary escalation for preservation for the universities. And again, I think governments should follow administrative law. They have to follow procedural norms. I don't think anyone should violate the law. But the basic question of whether external accountability is needed or internal reform is sufficient, I think is clear. I want to also deal with some objections. So what if a university leader says any reforms that are proposed from the outside will be seen as illegitimate, so they're never going to work? I would say that if a university administrator can't accept essential reforms without labeling them as like a type of capitulation, this is just another example of why external reform is needed. Because the content of the policy is what matters. That's not its source. Any university leader who can't distinguish between reforms that uphold core academic values and those that undermine them just because of their origin, if you don't like the person who's enforcing them, that's abdicating moral clarity and moral leadership. So in summary, I'd say like without this accountability and public pressure, there's really little hope for restoring this ideal of the university as non-sectarian and foundational to pursuing truth as a sacred enterprise, something that you pursue through reason argument, even when it's offensive, through ideological openness, through free inquiry, regardless of one's immutable characteristics, regardless of one's identity, and always using rigorous scholarly methods, come what may, whatever the answer is. These are not partisan values. These are not political values. They're the prerequisites of a functioning university. And I think any self-aware and mature leader would see the crisis for what it is. And you'd have to accept the need for external accountability, engage in good faith negotiation, and find common ground reforms, wherever they're coming from. Whether you love the person or you hate the person, anything that makes progress more likely towards the pursuit of truth. Thank you so much.